Over the course of this episode, we'll look at Boethius' writings on form, before concluding the series by looking at all four accounts of form in comparison, to understand how the ancient idea of form shaped the medieval understanding of God as form. In his famous work entitled De Trinitate, Boethius lays out his own discussion of God as form. His ideas are rather similar to those of Thomas Aquinas. For instance, he also describes the metaphysical nature of God as follows: divine substance is form without matter. Following somewhat in the footsteps of Plato, Boethius explains that a form-focused story can help us to understand the nature of reality. Boethius also brings in the top-down theory of the forms that is found in Plato. Things with form generate more things with form, and every being is from form. For from these forms which are outside of matter have come those forms which are in matter, and which produce a body. So when it comes to the nature of God, we should think of him as a fundamentally simple being who is form. As the form of the good, God is the primary form, as it were, the form at the top of the hierarchy. And as I mentioned earlier, these are clearly ideas which Plato had, and which have been brought into these medieval theories. Plato believed there was a form of the good, which was necessarily and metaphysically prior to the other forms. Not only is the form of the good at the top of the hierarchy of forms, it is also prior to the form of existence. This requires that the form of the good must exist in and of itself. Clearly, this fits in very well with Boethius' theories on the nature of God. God is necessarily prior to everything else, existing in and of himself. However, while God is prior to the other forms, he also appears to contain them in his divine nature. And this is fundamentally what Boethius means when he says God as form. Namely, that God is not only the form of the good, and everything that entails, but all the other forms are in him. However, it must also be clarified that in this philosophical account, the forms which are in God are not attributes of him, because if he were to have attributes, he would no longer be simple. Therefore, Boethius explains that God is form and truly one, and no plurality at all. At this point in the series, we have looked at and discussed the philosophical theories of four prominent philosophers from the ancient and medieval eras. The ancient philosophers were pagans who had no understanding of the Christian God. The medieval philosophers were Christians, who sought to better understand the nature of the Christian God. Yet despite these differences, they employed a metaphysical theory which ended up being pretty similar between all four of them. Now, some may argue that the medieval philosophers stole these ideas from the ancient ones, or perhaps they just needed a way to explain the metaphysical nature of the divine essence, and saw the ancient theory of the forms as a well-established explanation of reality, which they could use to bolster their theology. However, it seems more likely that the opposite is in fact true, or almost the opposite. Rather than the medieval philosophers using the ancient ideas to complete their theology, it was actually the Christian theology which explained and completed the ancient philosophy. The Platonic theory of the forms went quite far in explaining the structure of reality, but it fell short of completion. The form of the good was prior to everything else, and gave being to the other forms. But it couldn't be explained as anything other than just a higher form. By explaining that the Christian God was the form of the good, the previously established nature of that form suddenly made much more sense. But it was not as though Plato's theory of the forms was only imperfect because it lacked the Christian God. There were other modifications which later philosophers brought in, such as Aristotle's idea of substance as form and matter, or Aquinas' theory of intellectual substances. However, it is interesting to note how much Plato and Aristotle got right so many years prior to the medieval philosophers. There are still questions to be asked, such as the one concerning the goodness of creation in relation to the goodness of God, or concerning the Platonic forms, which are commonly considered to be simple, but are they fully simple, or simple in the way in which God is simple? But it is to be hoped that at this point it will be at least somewhat clear what the role of the form is in the philosophical discussions on the nature of God, and what it means to say that God is form, namely that all things have their being in and from God, and that all the forms are found in him. This concludes our series on God as form. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on our next philosophical discussion, which will begin very soon. Thanks for watching.